The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch yard as Jake Morrison bent down to pick up the scattered feed buckets. The metal clanged against the wooden fence posts, echoing through the quiet dawn air. He had been working at the Silver Creek Ranch for only 3 weeks, but already the routine felt familiar. Feed the horses at sunrise, mend the fences before the heat became unbearable, and stay out of trouble. That's when he first noticed the figure watching him from the barn doorway. Jake straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The man standing in the shadows was tall and lean, wearing a black hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about his posture made Jake's skin crawl. The stranger wasn't moving, wasn't helping with the morning chores, just watching. Always watching. "You new around here?" the stranger called out, his voice carrying a rough edge that made Jake's muscles tense. "Been here a few weeks," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady. He had learned early in life not to show weakness, especially around men who looked like trouble. And this man definitely looked like trouble. The stranger stepped out of the shadows, revealing a weathered face marked by years of hard living. His eyes were cold blue, the kind that seemed to look right through a person. A silver star was pinned to his vest, but something about it looked wrong. Too shiny, too new. "Name's Dutch Carver," the man said, extending a hand that Jake noticed was scarred across the knuckles. "I'm what you might call the law around these parts." Jake shook the offered hand, feeling the strength in Dutch's grip. "Jake Morrison, just a ranch hand." Dutch's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake's face. "Morrison, that name sounds familiar. You wouldn't happen to be related to Tom Morrison, would you?" The question hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Tom Morrison had been his older brother, a man who had died under suspicious circumstances 5 years ago. The official story was that Tom had been killed in a bar fight in El Paso, but Jake had never believed it. Tom was too smart, too careful to get himself killed over cards or whiskey. "Tom was my brother," Jake said carefully. A slow smile spread across Dutch's face, but there was no warmth in it. Well, small world, isn't it? He took a step closer, close enough that Jake could smell the tobacco and leather on his clothes. "Your brother and I had some unfinished business when he died. Real shame, that." Jake felt his hand move instinctively toward the gun on his hip, but Dutch was faster. Before Jake could even touch the grip, Dutch had grabbed his wrist in an iron grip. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, boy," Dutch whispered, his voice deadly quiet. "See, I've been waiting a long time for another Morrison to show up. And now here you are, bending over and working like nothing ever happened." Jake tried to pull his hand free, but Dutch's grip only tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do." Dutch released Jake's wrist and stepped back, but his hand remained hovering near his own gun. "Your brother stole something from me, something valuable, and I aim to get it back." "Tom never stole anything," Jake said, anger flaring in his voice. "He was an honest man." Dutch laughed, a harsh sound that made the horses in the nearby corral snort nervously. "Honest?" Tom Morrison was many things, but honest wasn't one of them. "He took something that belonged to me, and then he ran. Thought he could hide in El Paso, but I found him eventually." The implication in Dutch's words made Jake's blood run cold. "You killed him. Prove it." Dutch's smile widened. "The law says Tom Morrison died in a fair fight. Who's going to say otherwise?" Jake stared at the man who had murdered his brother, feeling rage build in his chest like a prairie fire, but he forced himself to stay calm. Dutch was wearing a badge, real or not, and he was clearly faster with a gun. Making a move now would be suicide. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked. "It's simple," Dutch said, adjusting his hat. "Your brother hid what he stole before I caught up with him. I've been looking for it ever since. But now I think maybe he told you where it is. Maybe wrote you a letter or left you a map. I never got anything from Tom. I didn't even know he was dead until months later." Dutch's eyes glittered dangerously. "Maybe, or maybe you're lying. Either way, I'm going to be watching you, Jake Morrison. Every time you bend over to pick something up, every time you reach into your saddlebags, every time you think you're alone, I'm going to be watching." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "And here's my warning to you," Dutch continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Don't say otherwise. Don't tell anyone about our conversation. Don't go running to the sheriff or the ranch owner, because if you do, you'll end up just like your brother. and that would be a real shame. Dutch tipped his hat and turned to walk away, but he paused after a few steps. "Oh, and Jake, I'll be staying in town for a while, making sure you settle in properly. Welcome to Silver Creek." Jake watched the man disappear around the corner of the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come to Silver Creek looking for honest work and a chance to start over. Instead, he had walked straight into the web of the man who had killed his brother. As he bent down to pick up the feed buckets again, Jake could feel eyes watching him from somewhere in the shadows. Dutch had meant what he said. He would be watching, waiting, looking for any sign that Jake knew more than he was saying. But Jake had a secret that Dutch didn't know. Tom hadn't just been his brother. They had been partners. And 3 months before Tom died, he had sent Jake a letter, not about stolen goods or hidden treasure, but about a corrupt sheriff in a small town who was stealing from the bank and killing anyone who got too close to the truth. Tom had been investigating Dutch Carver when he died, and now Jake was in the perfect position to finish what his brother had started. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Jake continued his work, but the shadows seemed darker now. He could feel Dutch's eyes on him, watching his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. But Jake had learned patience from his brother. He would bide his time, gather information, and when the moment was right, he would make sure Dutch Carver paid for what he had done. The game had begun, and Jake Morrison was ready to play. As he carried the last of the feed buckets toward the horse corral, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Dutch thought he was hunting a frightened ranch hand who might know something about stolen goods. What he was really hunting was a man who had spent 5 years planning his revenge. Every time Jake bent over, Dutch would be watching. But Dutch didn't realize that Jake would be watching him right back. And when the time came, Jake would be ready. The horses whinnied softly as Jake approached with their breakfast, their eyes bright and trusting. At least someone in this place wasn't planning to kill him. Yet, 3 days had passed since Jake's confrontation with Dutch Carver, and the man had kept his word. Every morning when Jake bent to collect the eggs from the chicken coop, he could see Dutch sitting on the porch of the Silver Creek Saloon, smoking a cigarette and watching. When Jake knelt to examine a loose horseshoe in the afternoon heat, Dutch would be there, leaning against a fence post 50 yards away, his cold eyes never leaving Jake's figure. The constant surveillance was wearing on Jake's nerves, but it was also teaching him valuable lessons about his brother's killer. Dutch was methodical, patient, and careful. He never got too close, never gave Jake an opportunity to confront him where witnesses might see. But he also never let Jake out of his sight for long. Jake had started varying his routine, taking different paths to the well, checking the cattle in different orders, anything to break the predictable pattern that Dutch was clearly memorizing. But no matter what Jake did, those blue eyes were always there, watching and waiting. On Thursday morning, Jake was repairing a section of fence when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned, expecting to see Dutch, but instead found a young woman with auburn hair tied back in a practical braid. She was wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better days, and her hands showed the calluses of honest work. "You're the new ranch hand," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I'm Sarah Miller. My father owns the general store in town." Jake touched the brim of his hat politely. "Jake Morrison, ma'am. Pleased to meet you." Sarah glanced around nervously, then stepped closer. "I need to talk to you, but not here. Too many eyes watching." She paused, looking directly at Jake. "Meet me at the old church tonight, after sundown. It's important." Before Jake could respond, she turned and walked away, her skirts swishing in the dust. Jake watched her go, wondering what she could possibly want to discuss that required such secrecy. As he returned to his fence repair, he noticed Dutch emerging from the saloon across the street, his attention focused on Sarah's retreating figure. The rest of the day passed slowly. Jake went through the motions of his ranch work, but his mind was racing. What did Sarah Miller want? Had she known his brother Tom? Or was this somehow connected to Dutch's presence in town? As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jake finished his evening chores and made his way toward the old church. The building sat on a hill overlooking the town, its white walls weathered and its bell tower leaning slightly to one side. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the new church was built closer to the center of town. Sarah was already waiting when Jake arrived, standing in the shadow of the building where she wouldn't be visible from the main street. In the fading light, Jake could see the worry lines around her eyes. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said softly. You said it was important. Jake kept his voice low, aware that sound carried far in the desert air. Sarah took a deep breath. I knew your brother, Tom. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. You knew Tom? He came through town about 6 months before he died. He was asking questions about Dutch Carver, about the bank, about some missing money. Sarah's voice trembled slightly. Tom was convinced that Dutch was stealing from the bank deposits, but he needed proof.
What kind of proof?
Sarah reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small leather journal.
Tom gave me this before he left town.
He said if anything happened to him, I should find his family and give it to them. But when I heard he was dead, I got scared. Dutch has a lot of power in this town, and people who cross him have a tendency to disappear. Jake took the journal with trembling hands. A leather was worn smooth by his brother's touch, and he could see Tom's familiar handwriting on the pages. Just holding it made him feel closer to his brother than he had in 5 years. What's in it? Jake asked. Names, dates, amounts of money. Tom documented every time Dutch made a bank deposit that didn't match the sheriff's salary. He also wrote down the names of 3 other men who started asking questions about Dutch. All 3 of them ended up dead within a year. Jake flipped through the pages, his anger growing with each entry. Tom had been thorough, recording not just the financial irregularities but also witness statements and observations about Dutch's behavior. It was the kind of evidence that could bring down a corrupt lawman, if it ever made it to the right authorities. Why are you giving this to me now? Jake asked. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Because Dutch killed my father last week. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. What? My father found out about the missing bank money. He confronted Dutch about it, thinking he could reason with him. They found my father's body in the river 3 days later. Dutch said he must have fallen in while fishing, but my father never went fishing. He was afraid of deep water. Jake closed the journal and slipped it inside his vest. I'm sorry about your father. Dutch is getting desperate, Sarah continued. The bank examiner is coming to town next month, and Dutch knows his scheme is about to be exposed. That's why he's so interested in you. He thinks Tom might have hidden evidence somewhere or told you something that could destroy him. Tom never told me anything about Dutch or the bank, Jake said. But now I have his journal. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm. You have to be careful. Dutch suspects that someone has evidence against him, and he's watching everyone. If he finds out about the journal, he won't, Jake promised. But I need to ask you something. Are you the only person who knew Tom left this with you? Sarah shook her head. Tom was careful, but he wasn't perfect. Dutch's deputy, Martin Webb, saw Tom talking to my father at the store, and Dutch questioned everyone in town after Tom left, trying to find out what he had been asking about. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Does Dutch suspect you have something? I don't think so. I've been careful to act normal, to go about my daily business like nothing has changed. But with my father dead, Sarah's voice broke slightly. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending. A sound from the direction of town made them both freeze. It was the soft jingle of spurs on stone, the sound of someone walking carefully up the hill toward the church. Jake motioned for Sarah to move deeper into the shadows, then peered around the corner of the building. Dutch Carver was climbing the hill, moving slowly and deliberately. In the moonlight, Jake could see that the man's hand rested on the grip of his gun. He had followed one of them, or maybe both. Go, Jake whispered to Sarah. There's a path down the back of the hill that leads to the creek. Follow it until you reach the bridge, then go home the long way. What about you? I'll handle Dutch. Jake's voice was grim. Just make sure no one sees you leaving. Sarah squeezed his hand briefly, then disappeared into the darkness behind the church. Jake waited until he was sure she was safely away, then stepped out into the moonlight. Beautiful night for a walk, Dutch called out as he approached the church. Though it's a strange place for a ranch hand to be wandering around after dark. I like the quiet, Jake replied, keeping his voice steady, and the view of the town from up here. Dutch stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to draw his gun if needed. Funny thing about views. They let you see things that maybe you're not supposed to see. Things that might get a man into trouble. I'm not looking for trouble. No, but trouble has a way of finding some folks anyway. Dutch's smile was visible in the moonlight, cold and predatory. Your brother, for instance. He came up to this very church before he left town. Had himself a nice long conversation with someone. Never did find out who. Jake felt the weight of the journal against his chest. Maybe he just liked the quiet too. Maybe Dutch took a step closer. Or maybe he was passing along something he shouldn't have had in the first place. Something that belongs to me. I told you before, I don't know anything about what Tom might have taken. Dutch's laugh was harsh. You know, Jake, I'm starting to think you might be telling the truth about that. But that doesn't mean you don't know other things. Things that could be just as dangerous. The threat was clear. Dutch suspected that Jake had learned something during his time in town, even if he didn't have whatever Tom had supposedly stolen. And that made Jake just as dangerous to Dutch's plans as Tom had been. I'm just a ranch hand looking for honest work, Jake said. Sure you are. Dutch turned to look out over the town spread below them. But you know what I've learned in my years wearing this badge? There's no such thing as an honest man. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has something they're hiding. The trick is figuring out what that something is. Dutch turned back to face Jake, and his hand was now resting openly on his gun butt. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep working at the ranch, keep minding your own business, and keep your mouth shut about anything you might think you've learned. And I'm going to keep watching you, just to make sure you remember your place. And if I don't? Dutch's smile widened. Well, let's just say the desert is full of places where a man can disappear forever. Your brother learned that lesson the hard way. I'd hate for you to have to learn it too. But that, Dutch turned and walked back down the hill, his spurs jingling softly in the night air. Jake waited until the sound faded completely, before allowing himself to breathe normally again. As he made his own way down the hill by a different path, Jake's mind was racing. Dutch was definitely getting suspicious, and the arrival of the bank examiner next month was clearly making him desperate. That gave Jake a timeline to work with, but it also made everything more dangerous. Back in his small room at the ranch, Jake lit a candle and carefully read through Tom's journal from beginning to end. The evidence was overwhelming. Dutch had been systematically stealing money from bank deposits for at least 2 years, probably longer. He had killed at least 4 people who had gotten too close to the truth, including Tom and Sarah's father. But evidence wasn't enough. Jake needed a way to get the journal to someone who could act on it, someone outside of Dutch's influence. The bank examiner would be perfect, but that was still weeks away, and Jake wasn't sure he could stay alive that long. Not with Dutch watching his every move and growing more suspicious by the day. As Jake blew out the candle and settled down to sleep, he made a decision. He couldn't wait for the bank examiner. He would have to find another way to bring Dutch down, and he would have to do it soon. Outside his window, a figure moved in the shadows near the barn. Dutch was keeping his word about watching, even in the middle of the night. But for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Jake felt like he had a chance. Tom's journal was the key to everything. Now Jake just had to figure out how to use it without getting himself killed in the process. The morning of the bank examiner's arrival dawned clear and hot, with not a cloud in the desert sky. Jake had been waiting for this day for 3 weeks, ever since Sarah had given him Tom's journal. During that time, Dutch's surveillance had become more intense and more threatening. The corrupt sheriff no longer bothered to hide his presence, following Jake openly through town and making sure everyone knew that the new ranch hand was under suspicion. Jake had used that time wisely. He had made copies of the most important pages from Tom's journal, hiding them in different locations around the ranch. He had also discovered Dutch's weakness. The man was so confident in his control over Silver Creek that he had grown careless about covering his tracks. The bank examiner, a thin man named Harold Fitzgerald, arrived on the noon stage. Jake watched from across the street as Dutch greeted Fitzgerald with a warm handshake and a broad smile, playing the role of the helpful local sheriff. But Jake could see the tension in Dutch's shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the crowd for potential threats. That afternoon, while Fitzgerald was examining the bank's records with Dutch hovering nearby, Jake made his move. He had arranged for one of the ranch hands to create a distraction by starting a fight at the saloon, drawing Dutch's deputy away from his post. With both lawmen occupied, Jake slipped into the sheriff's office through the back door. Tom's journal had mentioned a strongbox hidden behind a loose board in Dutch's office, and Jake quickly found it. Inside were bundles of cash that clearly didn't belong in a sheriff's office, along with several promissory notes signed by Dutch for amounts far exceeding his legitimate income. But most damning of all was a letter from Dutch's contact in El Paso, detailing the arrangements for selling stolen bank money and discussing the elimination of Tom Morrison. Jake photographed everything with a small camera he had borrowed from the newspaper office. then carefully replaced the items exactly as he had found them. He was just finishing when he heard footsteps on the boardwalk outside. Dutch's voice carried through the thin walls. "Everything appears to be in order. Mr. Bats Fitzgerald. As you can see, we run a tight operation here in Silver Creek." Jake slipped out the back door just as Dutch and the bank examiner entered through the front. His heart was pounding, but he had what he needed. The photographs, combined with Tom's journal, would be enough to destroy Dutch Carver. But first, Jake had to survive long enough to get the evidence to Fitzgerald. As evening approached, Jake made his way to the hotel where the bank examiner was staying. He had arranged to meet Sarah in the lobby, knowing that her presence would make the encounter look like a social visit rather than a clandestine meeting. Sarah was waiting nervously near the front desk, twisting her hands in her skirt. When she saw Jake, relief flooded her face. "Is he here?" Jake asked quietly. "Room 12, upstairs." "But Jake, Dutch has been asking questions about me all day. I think he's starting to suspect." Before Jake could respond, the hotel door swung open, and Dutch Carver walked in, his spurs jingling ominously on the wooden floor. His cold eyes took in the scene immediately. Jake and Sarah standing close together, their guilty expressions, the way they separated as soon as they saw him. "Well, well," Dutch drawled, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Jake Morrison and Sarah Miller. What a romantic picture." "We're just talking," Sarah said, but her voice trembled slightly. Dutch's smile was like a knife blade. "I'm sure you are. Talking about old times, maybe? Mutual friends? People you both used to know?" Jake felt the weight of Tom's journal and the photographs hidden in his vest. Dutch was fishing, but he was getting closer to the truth with every word. "Sarah and I barely know each other," Jake said carefully. "I just came to town to buy some supplies." "At the hotel?" Dutch's eyebrows rose mockingly. "That's interesting, considering the general store is 3 blocks away." The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other hotel guests were beginning to notice the confrontation, moving away from the 3 figures near the front desk. Behind the counter, the desk clerk was pretending to read his newspaper, but Jake could see his hand shaking. "Maybe we should continue this conversation outside," Dutch suggested, his voice carrying a clear threat, "away from innocent folks who might get hurt if there's any trouble." Jake knew that stepping outside with Dutch would be signing his own death warrant. A corrupt sheriff would claim that Jake had drawn on him, and without witnesses, no one would be able to prove otherwise. But staying in the hotel lobby wasn't safe either, not with Dutch growing more suspicious by the minute. That's when Harold Fitzgerald appeared at the top of the stairs. "Sheriff Carver," the bank examiner called out. "I was hoping to speak with you about some irregularities I've found in the deposit records." Dutch's face went white, then red. His hand moved closer to his gun, and Jake could see the desperate calculation in his eyes. Dutch was trapped between his suspicions about Jake and the immediate threat of exposure from the bank examiner. "What kind of irregularities?" Dutch managed to say. Fitzgerald descended the stairs slowly, pulling a small notebook from his vest pocket. "It appears that several large deposits over the past 2 years were never properly recorded in the main ledger. The amounts are quite substantial. I'm sure there's a simple explanation," Dutch said, but sweat was now visible on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Jake realized that this was his moment. While Dutch was distracted by the bank examiner, he could slip away and give Fitzgerald the evidence. But as he started to move toward the stairs, Dutch's attention snapped back to him. "Where do you think you're going, Morrison?" The use of his last name was like a gunshot in the quiet lobby. Several guests gasped audibly, and Jake could see recognition dawning in Fitzgerald's eyes. The bank examiner had clearly heard the name Morrison before, probably in connection with Tom's investigation. "I asked you a question," Dutch said, his voice deadly quiet. Jake stopped moving, knowing that Dutch was seconds away from drawing his gun. Around the lobby, people were beginning to panic, some heading for the exits while others dove behind furniture. "Actually," Fitzgerald said loudly, "I believe Mr. Morrison might be exactly the person I need to speak with." Dutch spun around to face the bank examiner, his confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" Fitzgerald reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking document. "I received a telegram from the regional bank office last week. It seems they've been investigating reports of irregularities in Silver Creek for some time. Reports that were filed by a Tom Morrison before his death." Jake felt his heart leap. Tom had managed to get word to the bank authorities before Dutch killed him. His brother's investigation hadn't died with him. Dutch's face had gone completely pale. Tom Morrison was a troublemaker who got himself killed in a bar fight. Any reports he filed were nothing but lies and speculation. Perhaps, Fitzgerald agreed. But the regional office has asked me to investigate these claims thoroughly. And part of that investigation involves interviewing Tom Morrison's surviving family members. He looked directly at Jake. I believe that would be you, Mr. Morrison. Dutch's hand was now resting openly on his gun butt. This is my jurisdiction. Any investigations here go through me. Not this one, Fitzgerald said firmly. This is a federal banking matter now. The irregularities I found today, combined with Tom Morrison's original reports, give us grounds for a full audit. He pulled another document from his jacket. I also have a warrant for the arrest of anyone found to be involved in banking fraud. The word arrest hung in the air like a thunderclap. Dutch's eyes darted around the lobby, calculating his options. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, but he was also desperate. And desperate men were the most dangerous kind. You don't understand, Dutch said, his voice rising. I'm the law in this town. I've kept order here for years. Whatever Tom Morrison told you, whatever lies he spread, I was just doing my job. By stealing money from bank deposits, Fitzgerald's voice was calm but implacable. By killing people who asked too many questions, Dutch's control finally snapped. His hand went for his gun, but Jake was faster. 5 years of planning for this moment had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. His own weapon was in his hand before Dutch's had cleared leather, and the sound of the shot echoed through the hotel lobby like a cannon blast. Dutch stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where Jake's bullet had struck him. His gun clattered to the floor, and for the first time since Jake had known him, Dutch Carver looked genuinely afraid. It's over, Dutch, Jake said, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man. Tom's journal documented everything, the stolen money, the murders, all of it. Dutch's eyes widened. You have Tom's journal? Jake reached into his vest and pulled out the leather-bound book that had started everything. He gave it to someone for safekeeping before you killed him. Someone who was brave enough to make sure his work didn't die with him. Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. My father wasn't the only one who knew the truth about you, Dutch. And now everyone will know. Fitzgerald was already reaching for his handcuffs. Dutch Carver, you're under arrest for bank fraud, theft and suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent. As the bank examiner read Dutch's rights, Jake finally allowed himself to breathe. The nightmare that had started 5 years ago with Tom's death was finally over. His brother had been avenged, and Silver Creek would be free from Dutch Carver's corruption. But more than that, Jake had learned something important about himself. He had come to Silver Creek looking for a quiet place to start over, but he had found something better, the strength to finish what his brother had started and the courage to stand up for what was right. As Dutch was led away in handcuffs, still clutching his wounded shoulder and muttering threats under his breath, Jake felt a hand on his arm. Sarah was looking up at him with tears in her eyes, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than grief. Thank you, she whispered. For my father, for Tom, for all of us. Jake nodded, slipping Tom's journal back into his vest. The leather was warm against his chest, and he could almost feel his brother's presence, finally at peace. The next morning, as the sun rose over Silver Creek for the first time in years without Dutch Carver's shadow hanging over the town, Jake was back at his ranch work. He bent over to pick up the feed buckets, just as he had on that first morning when Dutch had confronted him. But this time, no one was watching from the shadows. This time, Jake Morrison was truly free. The story of the corrupt sheriff and the ranch hand who brought him down would be told in Silver Creek for generations to come. But for Jake, the most important part was the simplest. He had kept his promise to his brother, and justice had finally been served. Every time he bent over now, Jake remembered Dutch's threat. Don't say otherwise. But Dutch's reign of terror was over, and the truth had won in the end. Tom Morrison could rest in peace, knowing that his sacrifice had not been in vain.